Time to introduce our next speaker. Ben Van Kerkwyk is a researcher, storyteller, and creator of the popular Uncharted X documentary series online. He's known for his evidence-based explorations into ancient civilizations, lost technologies, precision megalithic engineering. Today he's going to be talking about historical narratives and how those that he presents are actually challenging mainstream ideas and revealing precocious lost technologies. I got to tell you, he's one of my favorite speakers. Please welcome Ben to the stage right now here for Cosmic Summit 2025.
Thank you, Micah. Let me pop this thing out of here. Good to see everybody here. I hope you're all enjoying the summit. Lots of familiar faces from trips and from other years and other events, so thank you guys. Let's see. Oh, yeah, I should have pressed play before. So I'm particularly happy to be talking about the topic that I'm getting into today. It may not be what some of you are expecting to hear from me about today, although, trust me, we're going to get into more vase-oriented things and ancient high technology tomorrow in the classroom. Today's a little different, but I think this is the right time to talk about this because it relates quite closely to essentially the main topics that have been the theme essentially of this year's Cosmic Summit, and certainly the stuff that's been dominating the news on this topic in the mainstream media, because 2025 has been a pretty exciting time for new technologies, right, that are being applied to the ancient world. Obviously, the Beyond this synthetic aperture radar scanning the cuff rate pyramid, these extraordinary claims about massive superstructures deep in the Giza Plateau, took the world by storm, certainly took mainstream media's attention by storm. I was in Egypt when this came out. It was kind of crazy. We were in Egypt and just this was all of a sudden it just blew up. I was getting messages out of everywhere saying, have you seen these claims? And I'm like literally sitting in a hotel looking at the middle pyramid, the cuff rate pyramid. It's quite crazy. I typically don't just dive into things and offer an opinion on them without having my own research or understanding it. At the time, I didn't really understand a lot of the research. I got invited to the whole Piers Morgan debate thing, and I told him I'm not particularly interested in mainstream media in the first place, but I did get invited to that, and I said, look, I don't have much to say about it or to offer about it, but it's an interesting application for new technology. That's not the only thing that's happening this year. Obviously, you've also got the news about the exploration of the big void in the Great Pyramid, right? So this is the result of the muon detection and the work of the Scan Pyramids team that's been going on for the last almost 10 years at this point. And, our own Matt Bell, who's here, is stepping up to help fund some of the robotics research in that, which is just epic. It's awesome. Say thanks to Matt for that. The man is single-handedly moving this investigation along with his patronage of the vase scan projects and acquiring these vases, as well as being a patron now of this type of research. It's fantastic. But this is an application of new technology as well that's happening. You could probably throw into this also just the vase scan project, right? We're getting in and scanning more and more vases and more museums. The data set's growing. We've got other scientists getting involved, Max Zamilov. I'm going to get into a lot of that stuff in my classroom session tomorrow. And then, of course, if you watched Atlantica last night, it looks like we've got applications of more satellite technology, and Atlantis might have been discovered, or it might be certainly a big step forward in the search for that. So all of that's really interesting to see that. But what's interesting to me is what if I told you a couple of things, that a massive ancient underground structure in Egypt has already been discovered, that its discovery was done through scanning technology. In fact, it's been scanned several times with technology just like these technologies that you've been hearing about, and it's absolutely been confirmed to exist. This also isn't something new. It's not something that you could consider wildly speculative. It's not something that is coming out of nowhere, which we can definitely say, like the cuff rate pyramid stuff, it's just like nobody expected to see giant shafts and cubes and things 600 meters under the ground. But this is something instead has been documented extensively throughout history, including in Antiquity. And in our modern era, it's something that's been sought after by a very small but select group of individuals. This structure is not just any old thing in Egypt. It's something that is said to exceed in grandeur all of the wonders of the ancient world, and I am including the pyramids of Giza in that. And that if its discovery were true, it really should represent the biggest discovery of at least the 21st century, if not, dare I say, the millennium. The biggest discovery in 1,000 years. And that, somewhat scandalously, which we'll get into, its discovery has been suppressed and it's been covered up. Yet, with the advent of these new technologies, there are opportunities remaining to explore this. Anyone, I'm sure some of you know what I'm going to talk about. Anyone, any guesses? You got it. So, to me, the biggest opportunity out there, and one of the craziest stories that very few people have heard, is that about the great labyrinth of ancient Egypt. And when you hear the word labyrinth, this isn't something that, is that my 5-minute bell already? This isn't something that, the labyrinth of ancient Egypt isn't the thing that comes to mind straight away. When you think of labyrinth, a lot of people might go here to when movies were good and you could make weird things with David Bowie and Jim Henson puppets and make crazy movies. One of my favorites from my childhood. I'm kind of dating myself with some of this, I think. And of course, the other thing that pops to mind when you think of the labyrinth is where the actual etymology of the word labyrinth comes from, which of course is the Cretan labyrinth with the Minotaur, right? The Minotaur that was slain by Theseus with his, he pulled his string in there. It's a maze-like structure. There was this crazy half-man, half-bull thing that they were sacrificing maidens to, and he went in there with his sword and he slayed the labyrinth. Of course, the labyrinth was said to be built by Daedalus, the father of Icarus, the same Icarus who flew too close to the sun and his wings melted. It is a part of sort of classical Greek mythology. And in looking into this, if you want to get an idea for just how twisted some of that Greek mythology can get, then take a look at exactly how the Minotaur came to be, and I'll let you guys Google that one on your own a little bit later. Stories about Poseidon and King Minos and a white bull and King Minos' wife, it doesn't really matter. However, so the idea for this labyrinth, and indeed that's where the word comes from, right? Labyrinth, from the Greek, it is essentially referring to this structure on Crete that King Minos had built by Daedalus. If you go back to historical figures, this was known, and in fact, so one historical figure that wrote about the labyrinth and talked about this myth specifically was a guy named Diodorus Siculus, who lived in the 1st century BC, and he wrote, I think in his Histories, Volume 1, he said that it is even said by some that Daedalus crossed over to Egypt and in wonder at the skill shown in the building, built for Minos, king of Crete, a labyrinth like that in Egypt, in which, so the tale goes, the creature called the Minotaur was kept. Be that as it may, the Cretan labyrinth has completely disappeared, either through the destruction wrought by some ruler or through the ravages of time. But the Egyptian labyrinth remains absolutely perfect in its entire construction down to my time. And Diodorus was far from the only person to talk about the labyrinth. In fact, he visited it, and he does write more about its structure. I mean, he writes in it, one of the things he says, and to give an idea of it's like the labyrinthian nature of it, he says about the Egyptian labyrinth, for once in, it is impossible to find a way out again without difficulty unless one lights upon a guide who is perfectly acquainted with it. So by all accounts, this is a pretty complicated structure. Other people throughout history have talked about the labyrinth. Most notably, perhaps, is Herodotus, that great Greek historian. In his Histories Book 2, he talked about the labyrinth and the fact that he visited it in Egypt. And of course, Herodotus comes from several centuries prior to Diodorus, so he's like the 5th century BC was when Herodotus lived and he wrote his histories. And quoting him, he said, "This I saw myself, and I found it greater than words can say. For if one should put together and reckon up all the buildings and all the great works produced by the Hellenes," that's the Greeks, the Hellenes were the Greeks, "they would prove to be inferior in labor and expense to this labyrinth, though it is true both the temple in Ephesus and that at Samos are works worthy of note." The pyramids were also greater than words can say, and each one of them is equal to many works of the Hellenes, great as they may be, but the labyrinth surpasses even the pyramids. So Herodotus is like, he knows about the pyramids, he knows about all of the Greek temples. I mean, the Greeks, if you've been to ancient Greece, they built some amazing architecture. And these are his own people that he's talking about. And I don't know about you, but I spend literally a couple of months in Egypt every year. Been doing that for years now. Been there over a dozen times. And I just, every time, dozens of times have I stood in front of these pyramids. Or have I sat in the hotel across the street from it looking at them. Or we're drinking coffee or eating breakfast or something. And it's just, it never gets old, right? The awe that they spark in you is amazing. And, they are some of the most incredible pieces of architecture and stonework on the planet. And to imagine that there is something out there that is greater, that surpasses the pyramids, kind of boggles the mind, right? That it's not something small, it's certainly not something insignificant. So, what are we talking about here? Are there any details in what these guys tell us? Well, in fact, if you read the historical accounts of the labyrinth, they do get into some description details, and they talk about what it is and what it's made up of and what its architectural features are. And we're going to return to Herodotus here. And in it, he talks a little bit about its structure. He said, it has 12 courts covered in, with gates facing one another, 6 upon the north side and 6 upon the south, joining on one to another. And in the same wall surrounds them all outside. And there are in it 2 kinds of chambers, the one kind below the ground and the other kind above these, 3,000 in number, of each kind 1,500. So here we have Herodotus telling us a couple of things. There are 12 massive courts. We also know it's full of passages. There are different levels to this structure. It has a roof. It has a single wall. It's an enclosed space. It's not an open court. And he says accordingly, and in fact, so Herodotus, and he's being honest here, he visited the top layers of the labyrinth. He never was allowed to visit the bottom layers. And he tells us this by saying, accordingly, we speak of the chambers below by what we received from hearsay, while those above we saw ourselves and found them to be works of more than human greatness. So not only is this thing massive, it's also incredibly impressive in how it's made up inside. For the passages through the chambers and the goings this way and that way through the courts, which were admirably adorned, afforded endless matter for marvel, as we went through from a court to the chambers beyond it, and from the chambers to colonnades, and from the colonnades to other rooms, and then from the chambers again to other courts. Right? He is describing something that's very impressive, apparently. He gives us a little more information here about how the actual building is made, and he's also starting to give us some clues about where this might possibly be. And some of the features around it. So again, Herodotus quoting him. Over the whole of these is a roof made of stone like the walls, and the walls are covered with figures carved upon them, and each court being surrounded with pillars of white stone fitted together most perfectly. And at the end of the labyrinth, by the corner of it, there is a pyramid of 40 fathoms, upon which large figures are carved, and to this there is a way made underground. So this is really interesting, right? He's telling you there's a stone roof on top of this. These courts have white stone columns in them. And there is a pyramid that's either part of or off the end of the site, which is connected to the labyrinth underground. So these are all, just remember some of these features and these descriptions, because we're going to get into them a little bit more and look at what they might possibly mean. And for more descriptions of how the labyrinth was built and what its features are, we return to Diodorus Siculus here. Again, in his 1st century BCE Histories, Volume 1, about the labyrinth, he wrote, while in respect of carving and other works of craftsmanship, they left no room for their successors to surpass them. For when one had entered the sacred enclosure, one found a temple surrounded by columns, 40 to each side, and this building has a roof made of a single stone, carved with panels and richly adorned with excellent paintings. So I think Diodorus here is describing one of these courts, these colonnaded, columned courts. And he's describing it as having 80 columns in it, 40 on each side. Now, to give you an idea of scale, this is the Valley Temple. If anyone's been to Egypt and gone into the mighty Valley Temple, one of the biggest megalithic structures that we still have today in Egypt, it has 16 pillars in it. If you go up to the other end of the causeway in the Middle Pyramid Complex, the mortuary or pyramid temple at the end of that has 24 pillars in it. Maybe he was talking about something else. Maybe he was talking about something like this. This is Luxor Temple on a visit at night. And there might be 40 columns here. These columns are made piecemeal from sandstone, but there might be as many as 40 columns in this. He's talking about something that is twice the size of this, twice as many columns, and that there were 12 of them. So you take 80 columns in one hall, that's one of these halls, and now you've got 12 more of them, as well as 3,000 chambers. So this is quite a mighty construction. Now, one thing that he does say is that the roof was made of a single stone. I'm not so sure that would be the case here. Even I'm skeptical of that, because I think what he is referring to when he says this, if we hit play, that should go again. No, go back one. Go, and that way. Okay. So I think what he is referring to is probably the perfect megalithic structures and what these walls look like when they're complete and dressed. Today, in the Valley Temple, the surfaces of these blocks in the walls have spalled. Like there's only a couple of sections that have these really flat, sort of mirrored finished, sharp-edged patches to them. Most of the surfaces of these blocks have a lot of spalled off granite from the outside, and that gets worse at the corner, so it dips in, so you can actually see these joins. They're obvious, right, the change in the joins between the stone. But when these things were originally finished, you would have had a lot of trouble differentiating and seeing the joins between the stones. I suspect that's what Diodorus was making reference to here. Just going to skip forward here. So continuing with accounts in Antiquity of the labyrinth, and these are important because they give us clues about where it is, but also about some of the modern work, the new work that's happened that has to do with it, the correlation to these claims. We have another account coming from Strabo, who lived over like the year zero. He went from the 1st century BC through to the 1st century AD. He was an ancient Greek geographer, lived in Asia Minor, traveled all around the place. He also visited the labyrinth. In his, I think, geographies, he wrote, "In addition to these things, there is the edifice of the labyrinth, which is a building quite equal to the pyramids," so not quite as high praise as Herodotus, but close. "A great palace made up of many palaces, for such is the number of peristyle courts which lie contiguous with one another. Before the entrances there lie what might be called hidden chambers, which are long and many in number, and have paths running through one another, which twist and turn, so that no one can enter or leave any court without a guide." So again, we're getting the same description, right? Multiple of these big open courts with roofed in stone and with passages and hidden tunnels and chambers between them. Multiple levels. And the wonder of it is that the roofs of each chamber are made of single stones, and the width of the hidden chambers is spanned in the same way by monolithic beams of outstanding size, for nowhere is wood or any other natural or any other material included. So again, he's giving us clues to the construction style of the labyrinth, and this is important because Strabo also visited other places in ancient Egypt, places that are known to us. One of the things before we get there, he also mentions the pyramid. He says, "At the end of this building, which occupies an area of more than a stade, stands the tomb, a pyramid on an oblong base." So he's also making reference to a pyramid at the end of this building. And somewhere else Strabo relates this to, is something called the Memnonian. He says, "Above this city stands Abydos, in which there is the Memnonian, a palace wonderfully constructed of massive stonework in the same way as we have said the labyrinth was built, though the Memnonian differs in being simple in structure." Where do you think the Memnonian is referring to? A place in Abydos? It's the Assyrian. Strabo was known to have visited the Assyrian. At least there's accounts of him doing it. And what's crazy is he talks this about being simple in structure relative to the labyrinth. And the Assyrian, if you've ever seen it, is one of the most impressive megalithic structures in all of ancient Egypt. It's made up of massive beams of granite and quartzite that weigh in the region of 80, 90, 100 tons, fitted together precisely. In fact, when you go down into the Assyrian and stand there, you're standing on top of a stone structure that goes down at least 22 meters, as I've been reliably informed by the guy who's been in charge of the excavation project there for a decade now. He was known to have visited the Assyrian in the 1st century BC, and he described it as a royal building made of solid stone with workmanship similar to the labyrinth. And he also noted the Memnonium might have been constructed by Ismandes, the same builder attributed to the labyrinth at Hawara. So going on, Pliny the Elder, also 1st century AD. Let us speak also of the labyrinth. Pliny the Elder was a Roman geographer. He's a naturalist. He says, let us also speak of the labyrinths, quite the most extraordinary works on which men have spent their money, but not, as may be thought, figments of the imagination. There still exists even now in Egypt, the one which was built first, according to tradition, 3,600 years ago. He's giving us a date here, and if you go back, if Pliny was around year 0, let's call it, or in that first century AD, 3,600 years ago is 3,600 BC. I mean, the Old Kingdom of Egypt didn't kick off until around 2,800 BC, so almost 1,000 years prior to the Old Kingdom. Pliny is telling us that this labyrinth existed. He also makes reference to the Greek myths by saying, at any rate, that Daedalus used this as the model for the labyrinth which he built in Crete is beyond doubt, but it is equally clear that he imitated only 1/100th part of it. So as much as famous as the Cretan labyrinth is, it's evidently nothing like the Egyptian labyrinth. And by the way, even though Diodorus said that the Cretan labyrinth is gone, they do think that they found it. So there was excavations in Crete, and they do think that they found the remnants of what might have been that labyrinth. Going on with Pliny, the Egyptian specimens, to my considerable astonishment, has its entrance and columns made of Parian marble, while the rest of it is Aswan granite. Such masses being put together as time itself cannot dissolve, even with the help of the Heracleopolitans. God, I always get this wrong. Heracleopolitans, for they have regarded the building with extraordinary hatred. So Pliny's telling us here that these Heracleopolitans were probably quarrying this building. They were using the labyrinth as a source of stone. He gives us another really important clue here, and one thing he says that these entrance and these columns are made of Parian marble. What's Parian marble? It's calcite, right? He's probably referring to alabaster. It's the same sort of stone. You've got marble, calcite, travertine. You know, these are all forms of white calcite. It's a stone that's used in many megalithic structures in Egypt. It's a relatively difficult stone to obtain. It comes from the cores of natural springs. You have to dig down, find these natural springs that dried up millions of years ago, excavate the stone out. The white stuff comes from the very cores of natural springs. The further you get away, the more impurities get into that stone, and you get sort of yellow and brown colored calcite. But marble, alabaster, travertine, typically very white. Hard stone to obtain. And he's talking about these columns being made of white calcite, essentially. Where do we find white calcite in ancient Egypt? Well, this is quite interesting. This is what looks, obviously, it's a white calcite column base, right? That's what its original purpose was. But this is a white calcite column base that's been repurposed to make as an offering table. The front of it's been cut off, and it's been inscribed, and there's a depiction of a guy named Ra-Wer, who was a priest or he was a dignitary that existed in the 4th and 5th dynasty of the Old Kingdom. So we're talking, this is at the Giza Plateau, right? This is in the area, I think, to the south of the Great Causeway, the tomb of Ra-Wer. And so what's interesting about this is you're already seeing recycling and reuse of older column bases in the 4th and 5th dynasty. So in the very earliest times of ancient Egypt, they're evidently mining older structures to get these white calcite column bases and reuse them. Where else do we see white calcite column bases? Well, this is at Karnak. This is in the Great Columned Hall of Karnak. This is all attributed to the New Kingdom, to Ramses II in that era. They built these huge halls with these pillars made from sandstone. However, in some areas where they've pulled up the floor from where this columned hall is, what do we find at a lower level? We find white calcite column bases, right? So these are white. This is a evidence for a lower layer, an older layer of infrastructure that was once here, infrastructure that matches the description of what was at the labyrinth. You see these white calcite column bases beneath the existing columned hall. This place was renovated, it was rebuilt, and the older layer was made from white calcite. You can see another example of another white calcite or alabaster column base. This is at Karnak. This one's not at a lower level. Obviously, the level of the floor must have shifted, but these are older. Everything else after that is sandstone. You don't typically see sort of monolithic single-piece columns. These sort of things go way back to the oldest times in ancient Egypt and before that, and they're also associated with the labyrinth. Pliny also gives us some other clues about the size and the depth of the labyrinth. He says, men are already weary when traveling when they reach that bewildering maze of paths. So you're already tired getting into it. Indeed, there are also upper lofty rooms reached by ramps and porticos, from which one descends on stairways which have 90 steps each. Inside are columns of imperial porphyry, images of the gods, statues of kings, and representations of monsters. I don't know about you, but in my house, to go up and down the stairs, I think it's like 16 stairs. 90 stairs between different levels. This is also a really interesting clue for just how big and how many levels there were to the labyrinth. One more, Pomponius Mela. 1st century BC, he was also a Roman geographer. Some of the works that he wrote were in use until the year 1500. He also talks to us about the labyrinth. And he says, the buildings of Pasamich, the labyrinth, include within the circuit of one unbroken wall 1,000 houses and 12 palaces, and is built of marble as well as being roofed with the same material. So again, this white calcite, the marble, all these halls, the 12 halls, the 12 palaces, all surrounded by a wall and with a roof. It has one descending way into it and contains within almost innumerable paths, which have many convolutions twisting hither and thither. These paths, however, cause great perplexity, both because of their continual winding and because of their porticos, which often reverse their direction, continually running through one circle after another, and continually turning and retracing their steps as far as they have gone forward, with the result that the labyrinth is fraught with confusion by reason of its perpetual meandering. I don't know if he's describing like things that move in the labyrinth. It's almost like you actually have a real labyrinth where you're turning things around and opening doorways. But by many accounts, you needed a guide to get through the labyrinth. Like you could literally get in there, get lost and die. GLAD, right? Any Snake Bros fans in here? Okay. So very interesting. And we have a couple of depictions of what this might have looked like. These are constructions made from these accounts of these historical, classical authors. Because after this time, say the 1st, 2nd century AD, the labyrinth was essentially lost to time. It disappeared from record. There wasn't any accounts of it. And we go through the fall of the Roman Empire, 476 AD. The Renaissance happens, late 1300s, 14th century. And it's not until the Renaissance that an interest in the labyrinth starts to re-emerge based on these historical accounts. And we get depictions like these out of the Renaissance. And you can see the one, I think on the... Would it be the right for you guys? Left for you guys. There's 12 courts. There you can see there are 12 courts surrounded by a wall with figures that are painted. You have a maze-like structure in the middle. The one on the other side is just an insanely complex environment. 3,000 rooms. I mean, this was quite a building. Here's another depiction. This one's etched into copper, which I really like this depiction because it shows you a couple of things. We know that there was a town, and when we get into the location of it, there was a town built on top of it. The labyrinth was underground. You can see here this town. There might have been a town that sprung up as a quarrying site. In fact, this was confirmed in later years. But beneath the ground, you can see the magnitude of these halls, these massive halls with columns. I look at this image and I think of the mines of Moria. If you've seen Lord of the Rings, and Gandalf comes out and says, perhaps we can risk a little more light. I mean, this sort of stuff might have actually existed like this. It's absolutely crazy to think about. But, this was lost to time until we get these accounts. And then we get the Age of Reason and the rise of the scientific method and the emergence of what we would call classical Egyptology. And funnily enough, based on all of these accounts and other things, I mean, there's a lot more that these guys wrote about the labyrinth that I didn't talk about. They talked about it being nearby to a town called Crocodipolis, which is ancient Arsinoe. They talked about a big lake being nearby that was known as Lake Moiris. They talked about it being near a channel of water that was into a depression. And of course, they talked about the pyramid. And funnily enough, pretty much all Egyptologists from, Lepsius to Flinders Petrie to modern Egyptologists kind of all agree, like we think we know where that is, what description fits that, or what location fits those descriptions from classical authors. And that's in this area. It's something called the Fayum. So this map is showing you the Nile Valley, the Nile River, so it's that long streak of green. You've got Cairo up in the north, and obviously the green is the Nile Valley, like where all the, everything's irrigated and they grow food, everything else is desert. And then you see this massive sort of leaf-shaped thing that's off to the left-hand side. That's called the Fayum. It's a depression that lies to the west of the Nile. and there's a narrow channel that feeds into it. And this in historical times when the Nile flooded, this would traditionally flood and irrigate. And today it's green because Egypt still uses it to grow a whole heap of agriculture and food. And right there at the neck to the Fayum, you see that little passage of green that connects it. It's this channel that runs in there. That's an area called Hawara, and this is, if you zoom in on Google Maps, this is what you see at Hawara. You see a pyramid, the remnants of a pyramid. It's the pyramid of Amenemhat III, a 12th dynasty mud brick pyramid. And funnily enough, on Google Earth, you actually zoom in, it says Labyrinth. Even on Google Earth, it tells you, oh, here's the labyrinth. It's here. Like, okay. So this was kind of known. It's like, well, all right, what's there? We've got these classical accounts. This sort of matches the description. Well, when you go to this site, and I've been here a few times, there's not a whole lot to see. There is a big mud brick pyramid, right? This is the pyramid of Amenemhat III. There's a small little open air museum, I suppose, with pieces of stone. It's just sand that runs through it. If you go up on top, if you're lucky enough to get up on top of the pyramid, sometimes they'll let you, sometimes they don't. I've been up there a couple times. You can climb on top of this pyramid, and you can scan around. You can see all that green, verdant Fayum area, the neck of the Fayum where they're farming. And then it's just sand, and you can see everything's been potholed. There's been people digging stuff up here. Evidently, people have known for a long time this is probably the area of the labyrinth. There's a canal in there, which we'll talk about. That's an important feature on the site. But it's this huge area surrounding this pyramid that is supposedly where the labyrinth is. And if you walk out into this field, this rubble, this desert area, what do you find? Well, you do find big chunks of megalithic granite stones. Also alabaster pieces, a lot of that gets taken away because it's semi-valuable. But you can see there what a big chunks of what were fluted single-piece granite columns, and these were massive. You still see these big rose granite pieces just sort of scattered out in the desert. These might be remnants, they're likely remnants from the labyrinth. Another major feature on the on the side of Hawara is something called the Bawabi Canal. And this is actually quite an old canal. It's been around since 1830. French Freemason Lyndon de Bellefonte actually built it. He's the guy who built the Suez Canal, but it's said to have been built somewhere in the 1830s. And funnily enough, you hear these stories, like when the Egyptians come in there and they want to clear it out, they use it today for irrigation. So it connects farming water to be irrigated for all of the agriculture in the Fayum. Not all of it, but it's a lot of water going through it. And when these excavators would clear it out, I mean, they're just pulling up blocks of stone, like big blocks of granite, calcite, limestone, diorite, that sort of stuff. In fact, you can see some of the big quartzite pieces that are down here, and on the other side of the canal, you see big white blocks of stone. Right, this is running right over the top of where the labyrinth was supposed to have been. So once we get into the modern times, there's a few expeditions that have hit this. You can go and find these little accounts of people who've gone out to Hawara and talked about the mud brick remains and the remnants of towns and artifacts that are found there. You've got Paul Lucas in the late 17th century, Dr. Richard Pocock, 18th century. Luigi Canina wrote about it in the early 19th century. These are all visitors to the site. Probably most famously in this period was Napoleon Bonaparte. He visited this site in his Egypt expeditions in Description de l'Egypte. Him and his team of savants or geniuses, they went out, they were doing measurements, they were intensely interested in ancient Egypt. They even drew a depiction of Hawara here, I think fairly optimistically with the old snow-peaked mountains in the background, that they're really not there if you go to Hawara. There's not many snow-peaked mountains in the background. But it's a nice image of Hawara. And it's not until we get to what I would term the emergence of modern Egyptology with Carl Lepsius in the mid to late 19th century, where he was one of the first people to visit the site and draw it. And if in fact you can look at the Google Earth image to then Lepsius's drawing of Hawara, and it actually says on it, pyramid and labyrinth. And you can see these little structures that he's mapped on both sides of the canal. Now Lepsius said, well, this could be the remnants of the labyrinth, and these are like mud brick and stone structures. But as usual, one of my favorite characters throughout the time in history with Egyptology and the ancient world, it's not until Flinders Petrie turns up to do the first real large-scale excavations to explore this site. Now, he wrote prolific author, but he talked about Hawara in 2 or 3 different books, probably most importantly, 10 Years Digging in Egypt, and then later on, 10 or 12 years later, Hawara, Bihamu, and Arsinoe. He had 2 big seasons at Hawara. One was 1888 to 1889, and then 2 decades later, 1910 to 1911. And his initial interest was in the pyramid on the site. He actually is the guy who identified it as the pyramid of Amenemhat III from the 12th dynasty. But his primary focus was the labyrinth. He was well aware of the historical authors. He was using them as a guide. And that's what he was trying to investigate primarily at Hawara. Now, what's interesting about the pyramid here is it's not like the other pyramids. So, you know, these mud brick pyramids, people often think of the Giza pyramids, the massive stone pyramids. Egyptians kept building pyramids. I mean, even though, you know, we can argue about whether or not those are Old Kingdom pyramids or older. However, the pyramids after that time were generally smaller. They were nothing like as sophisticated or complex. They were made from mud bricks. But all of those older pyramids, all of the ones at Giza, always had their entrance on the north side. They're always, this main entrance goes through the pyramid in the north side. This pyramid's quite different. The entrance, there is a structure beneath it. I hesitate to say it's an entrance into the pyramid. I don't think it is. The pyramid was built on top of something because the entrance is below ground level here on the southwest corner of the pyramid. It's actually on the southern side of the pyramid in the western corner, the western end. And you can see it's actually made of massive megalithic stone. It's a descending passage that goes down into a structure beneath this pyramid. Everything on top of that is mud brick. Now, Petrie, being the guy he is, was the first one to explore this, and he actually cracked it and found what was beneath this pyramid. And I write here that Petrie was a savage because Petrie was a savage. There are so many stories about what Petrie got up to during this period that it's actually crazy to read these accounts. But because the entrance to this pyramid was on the southwest portion of the pyramid, he couldn't find it. So Petrie actually had to, he thought, okay, this will probably be on the north side. So he started cutting into the pyramid from the north side. And this is what he wrote about this, because he just try to imagine what this might have been like. He says, the sand between the bricks was in very thick layers, usually 1/2 to an inch, and being quite dry and clean, it ran out interminably in some parts, coming down in an hourglass, like an hourglass from the joints. It was needful, therefore, to board up the roof of the tunnel all along, as no native would treat the place with sufficient tenderness to avoid loosening the bricks overhead. I had to fix every board myself as the tunnel advanced. The bricks, moreover, were so large and heavy, being double the size each way of an English brick and weighing 40 or 50 pounds, that a single one dropped on a person would have settled his moving powers for some time to come. It was needful, therefore, to use the greatest care in loosening and taking down the bricks. So he's cutting into the pyramid from the north side, and he eventually finds it. So this is actually a rendering from Keith Hamilton, a friend of mine. I'm sure some of you have heard of Keith Hamilton's excellent work. He produces a lot of these layman guides to different structures, and he creates 3D renderings based on measurements from guys like Petrie. Phenomenal work. You can find all of his work, academia.edu, I think. This is a picture that he has created based on Petrie's accounts and measurements. So Petrie cuts into it from the north side. You can see the south side's kind of where that ascending passage is. So he's cutting in, and he hits those roofing blocks. Whoops, this one. Right, so he eventually discovers, he accesses the megalithic story. He gets into these roofing blocks, and these are massive blocks of stone, like they're granite. They're like 4 feet thick or 5 feet thick. He actually had to stop his season because his stonemasons were like, nah, we're not doing this. He said, you got to cut through this, and like, we're not cutting through this. So these dudes left. He went through 2 or 3 of them until he found some stonemasons who were willing to do the work to like cut through 4 or 5 foot thick granite beams to get into it. And so he then drops into that central chamber in here, and so he starts trying to explore it and figure out where's the entrance to this, like where does this go? And just listen to this. This is one of my favorite accounts on anything Petrie. Can you just put yourself in his shoes for a minute and imagine what this was like and why I think Petrie was he was just a savage. Thence I went exploring through the passages, so after he's dropped into the central chamber. Up the east passage, the muddy earth rose nearly to the roof, and we had to crawl through. At the south end of this, there seemed to be no exit, but a slight gap under the southeastern trapdoor showed that there was a way. And clearing out some earth, I got in far enough to stick tight, and I knocked the candle out. He's under a pyramid, he shoves himself in a hole, and he's like with a candle, and he knocks the candle out. Matches had to be fetched, as we were streaming with the heat, so that nothing could be kept dry, and the only garment I had on, so it's also insanely hot and humid. I recently went under the Black Pyramid, the mud brick pyramid of also Amenemhat III, funnily enough, at Dashur, and it was hot. It's humid, hot underneath those things. It's a difference to the stone pyramids. They seem to radiate heat, but the mud brick ones, they just seem to trap heat or something. Under the stone, I got into the southeastern chamber, and then to the south passage. It was so nearly filled with mud that we had to lie flat and slide along it, propelled by fingers and toes. At last I reached the southwest chamber. The blind passage being level did not promise a way out. The lean lad got up over the top of the first trapdoor in an incredibly shallow space, but found no exit. Then I slid down the narrow forced hole beneath the trapdoor and waded through the water in the antechamber. So in this antechamber was also half filled with water when Petrie was in there in presumably 1911 or around there. There at last I found a passage sloping considerably upward and knew that we were in the entrance passage. The way was worst of all here, as the ground was full of sharp crystals of sulfate of lime and the walls lined with more crystals which cut like a knife. Scraping a clear way, I squeezed up this passage for as far as I could and then began carefully measuring backwards through all the passages to the tunnel so as to know the position of its entrance. He's a savage who's crawling around in the pitch black underneath this pyramid, streaming heat, eventually finds where he thinks the entrance passage is, the sloping passage, then starts measuring his way backwards so that he can get out and calculate, all right, where do we cut into to get at the passage? And that's what we see today, like that the entrance passage is the one that Petrie actually uncovered. However, no one can enter this structure today. Even though that you saw the entrance before, no one can get into it today, and this is why. So you just watch this video, you can go in there a little ways, and it's a well-cut passage. Like, this is a typical kind of well-made, megalithic, very well-dressed stones. I'm in here with the same friend that took me to the top of the pyramid, but you can see the reason here is not clear until he does something. That's water. We can't get in there because of the water. So in Petrie's time in 1911, that antechamber at the bottom of this descending passage was half filled with water, and that water would have penetrated. There was mud and everything in all the other passages. And since Petrie's time, 100 years later, that water has risen up to now it's within like 3-4 meters going into this passage. Before I move on to what this means for that area and the labyrinth and the modern structures, what time am I finishing here? 5? 3:35? I think it's 5, right? Okay, this is fine. I do want to talk a little bit about what Petrie found under this chamber, because this is really remarkable. This is one of the more complex and interesting structures under any of the pyramids, and it's not something that really nobody knows about, but this was a massive structure that he cut his way into and looked at. And I think it was actually probably part of the labyrinth, if not contained an entrance to the labyrinth, because remember in those historical accounts they talked about there being both a way to the pyramid that was cut underground from the labyrinth, and in another case them talking about only one descending way into the labyrinth. And of course Petrie, there's other accounts where he's trying to figure out if there's some other passage, but he can't. The water's so salty, and he didn't want to put his head in it, so that they're like scooping around on the floor, sticking their face in the water, trying to feel these passages in the dark with a candle, sweating like crazy. I mean, I couldn't imagine. It's insane. But inside this weird, strange structure here, there's actually one of these, essentially a box. It's called the super chamber. It's actually a single piece of yellow quartzite that weighs in the range of about 110 tons, probably more. And this is what Petrie sort of conservatively estimated it at. These roofing beams that you're looking at are also around 80 tons. Many of the other blocks that are described in these trapdoors and passages that go around are in the 20 to 50 ton range. So this is completely megalithic stuff, very much of the same caliber that you might see in the whole King's Chamber structure inside the Great Pyramid. Very much the same sort of thing that you would see in the Assyrian, because funnily enough, what is another structure that is made up of massive blocks of quartzite and granite is, of course, the Assyrian. We already connected this to the labyrinth in the way it's constructed, but it's also connected to this structure beneath the pyramid at Hawara, because this is made up of the same stuff. That big lentil block that we just walked under here is made of quartzite. All of these pillars in here are 80, 90 tons of granite. The roofing beams are similarly sized, 80, 90 tons of granite. The walls around the Assyrian are made of quartzite. Same stone, same construction style as what we're seeing beneath the pyramid and allegedly what is in the labyrinth. So there's a connection here, because this is also one of the most mysterious buildings in all of Egypt. It's up there with the Valley Temple and all of these other things. Huh? Yeah, this is simple. According to, who was it? Diodorus, I think, was saying it was simple. Yeah. So Petrie wrote a little bit. I'm going to quote to you a little bit about what Petrie said about the labyrinth. And he said, though the pyramid was the main object at Hawara, it was but a lesser part of my work there. On the south of the pyramid lay a wide mass of chips and fragments of buildings, which had long generally been identified with the celebrated labyrinth. So remember that Carl Lepsius did that diagram with all of the walls and stuff, and so Petrie's investigating that. And he says, when I began to excavate, the result was soon plain, that the brick chambers were built on the top of a ruin of a great stone structure, and hence they were only the houses of a village as they had first appeared to be. But beneath them and far away over a vast area, the layers of stone chips were found, and so great was the mass that it was difficult to persuade visitors that the stratum was artificial and not a natural formation. So he's telling us that the ruins that people had associated with the labyrinth were actually just the ruins of a village or a place that people lived, likely the quarrying village. In fact, he talks about it here, but beneath that, at deeper layers, he found a layer of stone that was massive and vast. Beneath all these fragments was a uniform smooth bed of beton or plaster on which the pavement of the building had been laid. So he's saying, Petrie thinks he found a foundation. He's saying, well, this is the pavement, this is the foundation for whatever stood on top of this. The mere extent of it proved that it was far larger than any temple known in Egypt. All the temples of Karnak, of Luxor, and a few on the western side of Thebes might be placed together within the vast space of these buildings at Hawara. We know from Pliny and others how for centuries the labyrinth had been a great quarry for the whole district, and its destruction occupied such a body of masons that a small town existed there. So they were quarrying the stone from this site for centuries. It was like the local industry. All this information and the recorded position of it agrees so closely with what we can trace that no doubt can now remain regarding the position of one of the wonders of Egypt. How far then will the remains at Hawara agree with the descriptions of the magnitude and importance of the labyrinth? We read of the enormous extent of the buildings and of their exceeding in vastness all the temples of the Greeks put together, and that they even surpassed the pyramids. Of the beauty and magnificence of the work we cannot now judge, as almost every stone has long since been broken up and removed, but the extent of the area we can measure. On tracing these signs to their limits, it found that they cover an area of about 1,000 feet long and 800 feet broad. These mere figures will not signify readily to the mind the vast extent of construction, but when we compare it with the greater of other Egyptian temples, it may be somewhat realized. On that space could be erected the great hall of Karnak, and all the successive temples adjoining it, and the great court and pylons of it. Also the temple of Mut, and that of Khonsu, and that of Amenhotep III at Karnak. Also the two great temples of Luxor, and there still would be room for the whole of the Ramesseum. In short, all the temples on the east of Thebes and one of the largest on the west bank might be placed together in the one area of the ruins at Hawara. Here we certainly have a site worthy of the renown which the labyrinth acquired. So Petrie excavates, he finds this massive stone platform. He knows that it's been a site for stone and quarrying. There's remnants of a village and occupation through the Byzantine era and the Roman and Ptolemaic period before that. He thinks, damn it, nothing's left. I'm standing on this platform. This is the foundation for the labyrinth. And that's where it stayed. So really nothing else happened at Hawara or at the labyrinth for 100 years until Louis de Cordier. Now, Louis de Cordier is a champion of the labyrinth. We'll talk a little bit more about him as we go forward here. But he put together something, and he funded something called the Mataha expedition, which happened in 2008. And it was a cooperative event. Louis funded it. It was a cooperation between Ghent University in Belgium and the NRIIG, which is the National Research Institute of Astronomy and Geophysics, based in Cairo. And they went down, also the Supreme Council of Antiquities at the time, headed by you-know-who, Zahi Hawass. And they went to the site of Hawara and they scanned it using a whole bunch of geophysical techniques, things like ground-penetrating radar, geomagnetism, electrical resistivity tomography, very low-frequency electromagnetic testing. And you can see Louis standing there, and there's the ground-penetrating radar guys working away at Hawara in front of the pyramid. Cut a long story short, They found the labyrinth, and they found that there's still plenty there. They scanned a couple of different sites here. One site 150 meters by 100 meters to the south of the pyramid, and another roughly 100 meter square or 80 meter square site over on the other side of the Barwabi Canal. And you can see the guy doing the geomagnetic testing here in this image. And what they found was pretty remarkable. This is actually really astonishing. The labyrinth is confirmed, and it's confirmed to be there. This is a scan result from, I think, the VLF testing. You can actually see this is a big area. This is 150 meters on the horizontal axis by 100 meters on the vertical axis. So these are big, thick stone walls. You can see the labyrinthian nature of it. There are chambers, there are passages, there are walls stacked up. And this is what they concluded after testing all of this. So this kind of explains what we're looking at. You can see the ground surface at the top here, and then this green bar is essentially the Roman and the Byzantine town. So it's this chaotic collection of ruins from that town that was once there. And then you have the water table, the modern water table, which we're going to talk a little bit about. Below that is the slab found by Petrie when he dug down to roughly 5 meters below the ground. The water table's just above that, around 4 to 5 meters. And then below that, so below the slab and below the water table, using these techniques in the 12 to sort of 6 meter range, they find just this massive stone structure that is likely the labyrinth. And in fact, this is what they said in their report, that yes, these decayed mud brick features are chaotic. They fit the Ptolemaic Roman time, the Byzantine town that existed there. And it says here that at a depth of 8 to 12 meters, a grid structure of gigantic size made by very high resistivity material like granite stone. This states the presence of a colossal archaeological feature below the labyrinth foundation zone of Petrie, which has to be reconsidered as the roof of the still existing labyrinth. The conclusion of the geoarchaeological expedition counters in a scientific way the idea that the labyrinth was destructed as a stone quarry in Ptolemaic times and validates the authenticity of the classical author reports. So not only is it validating what the classical people wrote about it, it's still there. Okay. So as he says, same basically ran through it here, right? The research verifies the presence of the archaeological features south of the pyramid of Amenemhat III. They cover an underground area of several hectares. They have the prominent signature of vertical walls on the geophysical results. The vertical walls with average thickness of several meters are connected to shape nearly closed rooms which are interpreted to be huge in number. Consequently, the geophysics survey, initiated with the permission of Dr. Zahi Hawass, the president of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, and conducted by the NRIAG with the support of Ghent University, can now officially verify the occurrence of big parts of the labyrinth as described by the classic authors of the study area. They found the labyrinth, and we know it's still there. So why wasn't this massive news? This happened in 2008. Anyone hear about this in 2008? No one heard about it, right? It was crazy. So what happened? Well, after they did their survey, they did a public lecture at Ghent University in Belgium that was barely attended. Some of the Belgian press went to it. And then the project was abruptly shut down. And what they said about this, and this is the way that expeditions work in Egypt, if you don't know. There's lots of universities all around the world get involved with what's today the Department or Ministry of Antiquities. Back then was called the Supreme Council of Antiquities. Zahi Hawass has been a powerful figure. You always have to partner with them. Like, they give universities and researchers permission to do stuff. Typically, it also means that the only person who can release findings contractually is the Antiquities Department, Zahi Hawass in particular. You might have remembered, if you looked at the Scan Pyramids project back when they first announced, they went rogue, I think around 2015, and said, we found this big void and there's chambers inside the Great Pyramid, and Hawass has been quoted as saying, they didn't find anything. They don't bring anything to Egyptology. They're offering nothing new. And if there is something there, we knew about it already. And what happens a couple of years later when they do actually drill into the pyramid? Who's the one standing in front of the press and who's making the announcement and sharing that, I discovered this new chamber in the pyramid? This is how it works, right? This is with Hawass. And what they wrote about that, so this was shut down. They were waiting. It says here the conclusion of the physical of the survey is, however, still waiting to be internationally released by Dr. Zahi Hawass, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities. Louis de Cordier is forced to sit on this for at least 2 years. 2 years later, 2010, he puts up a website called labyrinthofegypt.com. It's no longer there, by the way. He releases the paper, and he says, after 2 years of patience, we decided on June 2010 to oppose all cunning and deceit by posting the conclusion of the at the labyrinthofegypt.com website. And in it, they wrote, since the release of the scan results at Ghent University public lecture, Dr. Zahi was requested to stop communicating our results, intimidating the Mataha expedition team members with Egyptian national security sanctions. So Hawass said, and I've talked to Louis de Cordier about this, he says, they threatened, so basically he said it's a matter of national security. You can't talk about this. If you do, we're going to arrest you, we'll find you, whatever, and if you ever come back to Egypt, we're going to put you in jail. Don't talk about it. So they had to force to sit on it for 2 years. Louis de Cordier says enough's enough, puts it on the website. Again, not really capturing the world's attention. You know, you have to look pretty hard to find this Mataha paper. You can get it on my website. You have to look even harder today to find it because this website no longer exists. But you have to ask why. Why did he do that? Why would you do that? Well, I think it's a complicated answer. And one of the things has to do with the rising water table in Egypt. Everyone may be familiar with this. You saw from Petrie's time, the water down in the antechamber, to today being, you know, close to the entrance of that pyramid. It's risen several meters. This is footage I took from the bottom of what's called the Osiris shaft at the Giza Plateau. So halfway down the causeway, there's 3 different chambers, goes down about 150 feet. You've got to descend down these crazy ladders. And the very bottom chamber, and there's actually a big granite box in this chamber. You go down a ladder, there's a little patchy bit of mud that you stand on, and you can kind of look down and you can see, but that water table's risen up, and there's actually a big chamber with a box, and then there's tunnels running off from that have never been explored. You know, Trevor Grassi's here, he probably knows something about those. They've never been explored, but that water table's been rising. So why has the water table been rising? What's going on? Well, one of the reasons for the water table rising has been the construction of what's called the Aswan Dam. It's the big dam in Aswan. So there was a dam made by the British around the turn of the 20th century. And in the 1960s, the Soviets worked with Egypt to build just the Great Aswan Dam, the big dam on the Nile in Egypt. And you can see here on the map, they actually, when they built this dam, they created what is the world's largest man-made lake, Lake Nasser. It's massive. If you've seen Abu Simbel, they had to move Abu Simbel up. This also connects to the vase research because this flooded Toshka and all of these sites in the north of Sudan and southern Egypt where they found a lot of these very old vases and burials. That's why all we've got to go on are these photos from, like, again, the turn of the 20th century. And what this did was it stopped the annual inundation on the Nile. So when they put this in there, now no longer does the Nile flood. And it sounds a little counterintuitive. You're like, well, how come the water table's rising then? Well, not only does it stop the Nile from flooding for 3 months of the year, the impact it's having is it's stopping the 9-month dry season. Right? So for the rest of the 9 months, there's less water in the Nile, meaning the groundwater doesn't rise as high, or it's not rising at the same rate. But since the 1960s, that groundwater has been slowly rising. And you've got guys like Zahi, they've been investigating under the Sphinx to say, well, where's the water table at? It's a concern for a lot of these sites, and it's certainly a concern at Hawara. So, is this a case of the truth being suppressed? Certainly that's what's happened. Or is this more of a political expediency thing? I actually think the answer lays somewhere in between. I think it's mostly a political response. Because think about it. Look at the size of this site. Like everything we've talked about with the labyrinth, it's massive. The whole site's massive. You've got thousands of feet, and it's the groundwater, I mean, these ruins and whatever's down there is being destroyed, damaged by very salty, shallow groundwater that's coming in. It is quite saline. It is quite salty, this water that's coming in on the site. At the same time, this site occupies this area of, you know, the neck to the Fayum, which is Egypt's agricultural zone. And trust me, Egypt needs to grow all the food they can. They're the world's biggest net importer of wheat. And in order to fix this, it's going to, first of all, cost you millions and millions of dollars to try and figure out how do we even remediate this problem? How do we start remediating this problem? How do we then spend the money to excavate it, to start preserving the site? You got years of work ahead of you, millions of dollars to spend. It's not like Egypt has a lot of spare cash laying around. They're just lurching from financial crisis to financial crisis. In order to do that, you might have to start monkeying with the irrigation water, messing with farmers' water, messing with your agriculture. And on the other hand, if you say, yep, we found the labyrinth, but too difficult, we're not going to do anything about it. Well, now you're going to attract a lot of criticism because this is legitimately, for the people that know, one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world, said to surpass the pyramids. Like, this is the discovery of the millennium. So I think the most expedient thing to do, and this is probably what happened, is like, this never happened. This never happened. We didn't find anything. There's nothing to see here. Move along. And in fact, funny story, if you followed the podcasts that Zahi's done, or you've seen the responses he's made. I mean, I asked him the same questions, and he had the same responses that he had on Joe Rogan 10 years ago, 2015 in Egypt, when I was there with Graham Hancock, and we talked about stuff like ground-penetrating radar. And he's long held that he doesn't believe in ground-penetrating radar, right? Never found anything with it. There's nothing to see here. I genuinely think this, as well as the Sphinx, because there's been at least 2 ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Sphinx and the area in front of it. Both of them showed large regular chambers, and he dismisses that. I think that's the reason he says he doesn't believe anything in ground-penetrating radar, and that he's never found anything with it. He's just like, no. All this stuff that we have found with these technologies, forget about it. So, story doesn't end there for the labyrinth. Funnily enough, once this study actually happened, Cairo University went out there with Wrocław University, which I think a Polish university, and they started to do a geological survey of the site. Now, they were primarily interested in where's this water coming from. So they dug geological test pits, they dug boreholes, they did some ground-penetrating radar work there. By the way, they also found anomalies in the ground-penetrating radar, which are interpreted as cavities and spaces. And they were trying to map out and figure out, where is this water coming from? Like, what's it going to take to fix the site? Unfortunately, this research has never been published until 2017. So, again, nearly 10 years later. And what happened here was very similar to what happened in the Mataha expedition. Zahi Hawass, and this is according to these guys, it's not my words, okay? Zahi, if you're watching. Zahi Hawass, he halted the mission. He jailed the director of the mission, Professor Alameddin Shaheen, who was the then dean of Cairo's archaeology faculty, who then, was obviously swiftly ousted from his post after he was released from jail. And he stopped all research into the site. What did they find? They did publish their data, like I said, eventually in 2017. Well, they found that, it's a difficult problem to solve. It's an expensive problem to solve. We've got shallow groundwater coming into the site from the southwest, from the north and the east. The upland side, or the northern side of the pyramid, is like shallower water, so it's more water is coming in. It's 1 to 3 meters above the level of water in the canal. The groundwater coming on the south side, actually it's the groundwater on the south side is found a little deeper. It's still like 0.5 to 2 meters above the level in the canal. And you might be wondering, how come the groundwater is at a higher level than what's in the canal? Well, it's generally due to the wicking feature of the soil there. So it's like that groundwater's coming in, that's being wicked up and lifted up, like water would wick up anything you've put like a tissue or something in a glass of water, it wicks up. They also said the deeper water may be coming from a separate aquifer, and then ultimately more excavation is required to determine the source and direction of this water. So yes, it's a very difficult problem to solve. So again, we're left with not much happening. And that's, again, until I think the advent of what's happening a lot, and we're seeing now, and this is the connection to what you've been hearing at this conference, it's a connection to the space-based surveying. So in 2015, along comes Dr. Carmen Bulter and Klaus Dohner, and rest in peace, Carmen Bulter. I think she unfortunately passed around 2022. But she's long been a champion of trying to find the labyrinth. And she has also done, and she did an excellent documentary series called The Pyramid Code, if anyone's watched that. It features and is based on the work of somebody else who I greatly admire and respect, Abdel Hakim Ayawan, the father of my very good friend Yusuf Ayawan. Also, rest in peace, he has since passed. However, she was looking to see what can we do to find this labyrinth, and she happened to be talking to Klaus Dohner. Klaus Dohner is also like an alternative author and a researcher, and he said that he happened to have these German and Austrian friends that had invented a new technology that was able to see kilometers into the ground based on space and satellite observations. Sound familiar? So at the time when I talked about this, I couldn't find any information about what this technology was, and I was a little skeptical. However, these days there's a bit more information about what technique Klaus is talking about. There is actually a company that his friends created, and a technology they created. They say that they can go down 6 kilometers, scan into the ground 6 kilometers. Also, I just want to mention while I'm here, Andrew Barker, who's the bald gentleman standing next to Carmen Bolter. He's an ex-tech executive. He is also a champion of the Labyrinth. He's been funding a lot of this research over the last several years, so just shout out to him and his persistence in trying to uncover and make more people aware of the Labyrinth. But this Geoscan systems remote sensing is a similar it's a little different to what you've heard in this conference, but it's a technique that also works from space. This says that they can look some 6 kilometers deep using proprietary processing techniques. It involves modeling light and its interactions with matter based on more complete implementations of Maxwell's equations, coupled with a more complete understanding of the mathematical nature of the constant I, which is the imaginary number representing the square root of -1. And including these new insights makes complete spectral analysis more complete. Filters are then applied, which allows the detection and identification of substances by a means similar to utilizing Fraunhofer absorption lines to observe substances in the atmosphere of stars. That's what I had heard about this technique, that it was used to determine, what's the chemical composition and substances of stars. But apparently you can utilize it to look beneath the ground. And then, of course, which comes along with a lot of these proprietary techniques, we regret having to withhold details of the process involved. It requires intensive computation utilizing computers, software, and special processing hardware to apply our techniques. The best way to know that these techniques are valid is to look at our results, particularly the special study we ordered recently, which detected water in Morocco. So this is, if I have one problem, it's the verification of some of these proprietary scanning techniques is really hard to come by, and when you're making such extraordinary claims, it's a hurdle that has to be overcome at some point. However, this isn't the only scan that's happened here, but just to stick with the Geoscan system that Carmen Bolter and Klaus Dohner looked at, they did go and they found water in Morocco. So it's been used to find and drill wells. They've also used it to find gold at much deeper depths in Bolivia. They used it to find oil deposits offshore in Nigeria. And this is what they came up with when it came to the Labyrinth. So again, we see a modeling, a three-dimensional modeling of these scan results of the Labyrinth. It's sort of like you can see the Bawabi Canal, you see the pyramid, and what you're seeing here is basically multiple layers, right? These big chambers, big passages that go down, and you can see some of them descending down into the ground. And this is what they said. So this is if we lay it out on like a flat map with the different levels being shown here in different colors. Basically, they say that the bedrock begins at 18 meters, so you've got sedimentary layers above that, but the bedrock starts at 18 meters. What's in the Labyrinth is essentially a network of monumental spaces. We've got some halls that measure 80 meters by 50 meters, so massive open halls, linked by giant corridors at depths of 40, 60, 80, 100 meters and beyond. So think about that, and then think about what the ancient authors were talking about. These giant open halls full of columns, these palaces or these temples, 12 of them, these big open spaces. Talked about that there's 90 steps between different levels. Does that sound like it might go 40, 60, 80 meters down? So we're starting to see some correlation here. And so when these scans come out, again, Louis de Cordier got involved, and they got very excited. Andrew Barker, Carmen Bolter, they went back to Egypt. They had a patron, they had a supporter in Egypt who was a real estate tycoon. They tried to go into the Ministry of Antiquities to say, hey, we need to go and investigate this. Look at this stuff. Look what we found. Remember what we did in the Mataha expedition? And to quote Louis de Cordier, yet the trip faltered. Our Egyptian sponsor, a real estate tycoon, vanished hours before our meeting. High-ranking bureaucrats shunned our pleas to preserve Hawara, a site decaying in plain sight. Rivalries within the ministry stymied us. Hawara was a pariah, its name a whispered curse. He even tried to make a TV show based about Hawara. And according to Louis de Cordier, this is quoting an NBC Universal executive producer, told him this over the phone, said, "The Labyrinth of Egypt is the atomic bomb of ancient history, and we aren't going to mess with it." But it's there. Now, anyone recognize this term and these gentlemen? You guys all watched Atlantica last night, right? Merlin Burrows. So Merlin Burrows, at the same time in 2015, again, this information has only come out very recently. But here you have Tim Akers, again, rest in peace, Tim. And the CEO Bruce Blackburn, he was also quoted in the movie he was speaking, but Merlin Burrows also scanned Hawara. I know it was briefly mentioned in the documentary, but they did scan Hawara. Now, I don't know if it got into Tim's background, but he was, of course, ex-military. He worked in the British Army Satellite Scan Security Division, and the way their technology works is essentially it takes these high-frequency satellite images from like private orbital agencies, and then they run through these military or classified facilities. At least that's what they say about the Hawara scan. I know they've taken those capabilities and then implemented them in their own proprietary manner. They're used in combination with the constant vibration of the Earth's geophysical activities. Again, this sounds pretty similar, right, to some of the SAR and the Doppler tomography from Biondi and May. So I don't know if it's the same. I think it's a different technique, but it seems to use some of the similar features. And he says they can distinguish between granite, diorite, limestone, metal. They can map voids and tunnels with precision down to a few inches, or the size of a wristwatch is what they said. So very accurate by all accounts. And if you want to understand how this works, this is sort of quoting, I think it was either Tim Akers or it was Andrew Barker talking about it. He says, picture a pan filled with water. Drop several pebbles into it and ripples form, colliding into intricate wave patterns. If you could freeze that wave instantly and lift out the ice, shining a light beneath it would project a 3D image of the pebbles at impact, a hologram born from frozen ripples. Tim's technology does this on a grand scale and with far greater precision. And in fact, it has its roots in the military world, and they say that this tech could detect a submarine's path by analyzing the residual water ripples that were left behind, essentially fluid footprints, right? And what you're seeing here is fairly complex images. You actually, the different colors represent different depths. So it's a compressed sort of two-dimensional, three-dimensional image of multiple depths, blue being the deepest here. So there's a lot of data here to try and interpret. However, this is what they said about this stuff. So again, this is what Tim and crew said about the labyrinth. He said it's full of vast chambers with massive walls plunging into the bedrock. Colossal complex of great halls at 40, 60, 80, 100 meters and deeper. An atrium of approximately 40 meters by 100 meters long. Again, these big open colonnaded halls. Followed by a central chamber of 44 by 44 meters. Cube, anyone? There were 4 layers of structures that he found. 5 if you count the surface above the mother rock, which is, you know, the Byzantine and Roman era mud brick. But in the labyrinth itself, there seems to be 4 layers. These layers are separated by 20 to 50 meters and align quite strikingly with elements seen in the Hawara Geoscan Survey 13. Those also showed 4 levels. However, my scans reveal a clearer separation between the top 2 layers and the bottom 2. So we're saying, again, this is matching the historical accounts, 90 steps between layers, multiple layers. It's matching the same results that they got from the completely different technology, the Geoscan results. And Tim also says that the deeper structures, those ones in the bedrock, are likely free of groundwater and are hollow. So this surface water is not penetrating down into the bedrock. These are closed chambers that seem to be hollow and still there. So he said something else that I found absolutely fascinating. What is possibly down there? He said, and this is quoting Tim Akers, right, from Louis de Cordier, so a bit of hearsay here. Unfortunately, you know, Tim's not around to confirm this, but this is what it said that he said. He said, all layers converge at a central corridor or avenue like the atrium of a shopping mall where you can see all floors from one vantage point. My personal interpretation is that this entire hall was constructed to house a centrally positioned freestanding object about 40 meters long. They found this object. The central object is hard to classify. It appears metallic, not stone or wood. I named it Dippy after the giant Diplodocus skeleton in the Hintz Hall of Natural History Museum. It could be anything. Its shape resembles those tic-tac hard mints. It might also be an upright disc or even a colossal shenring. That big object alone raises profound questions. How did it get there? Why is it there? A more speculative theory is that it's some kind of portal, either interdimensional or interstellar, a stargate. Its material signature is unlike anything I've seen in my entire career, but it's there, undeniably there. I'll let the future find out what Dippy is. So not only do we have this incredible structure that seems to have all of this remnants of history and it's contained by everything, but there seems to be a 40-meter long freestanding metallic object in a chamber beneath the ground here at Hawara. Seems like it's worthy of investigation. So let's talk a little bit about the correlation between all of the works that's been done at the Labyrinth and at Hawara. The Mataha expedition seems like it revealed only what would have been the very top layer of the Labyrinth, the very top layer. So remember, they said there's the top 2 layers and then there's like a deeper bottom 2 layers. The Mataha expedition showed us the top layer. The geoscan and the Merlin Burrows satellite technology results seem to be quite well aligned. Tim Akers said it himself, and they came up with the same conclusions, different technologies, different techniques. The historical accounts match this data and these findings within reason and understanding the language of the time and the descriptive nature of these writers of antiquity. Herodotus talked about an underground passage to the pyramid. They talked about there being 12 open courts, 3,000 chambers, 90 steps down to get to the next level, and also that there were vast halls and big open spaces. And I think most intriguingly is that Petrie was the last person to be in the Hawara pyramid, but he couldn't continue his exploration of it due to the groundwater. I think he was really close to discovering either the entrance to the labyrinth or a connecting passage that led to it, and he was actually in part of it. I don't really know, but I think he was super close to it, because remember, it's talked about having the labyrinth connects to the pyramid or the structure beneath it, and that there was only one way into the labyrinth. So what's my opinion? Most of this has been me reporting on what other people have done. My perspective on this, in general, I do remain cautiously optimistic about all of these different space-based scanning technologies, which are still fairly proprietary. I mean, I want to believe, but I think there's some proving out to do, and I hope, I think they're onto something. I think all of the correlation, you can't ignore that. I think it's absolutely worthy of further investigation. It should be spurring interest around the world. But at the same time, well-established and known technologies like ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, electromagnetism, these techniques that have been around for a long time, definitely established that the labyrinth is there at Hawara. It's there. There's no question that the labyrinth is at Hawara and that it's still intact. And that makes it really interesting to me. What could this possibly represent? Right? What could the labyrinth be? Well, it seems to be in the same style of construction as other mysterious, incredible temples around the world. The Valley Temple, the Assyrian, the King's Chamber structure inside the Great Pyramid. Like these very heavily eroded, sort of very ancient structures that are remnants of the builders. I suspect that the builder culture, if you subscribe to the idea of an older civilization, somebody building this megalithic work that was later then inherited and then reused and renovated by the dynastic Egyptians, I absolutely think the labyrinth fits this mold. We know the dynastic Egyptians were there, right? If the Greeks and the Romans were getting in there during the Ptolemaic period, the Egyptians were in there, they were likely carving it and painting it, and then it got turned into a quarry and everything else. Could have been a library, could have been a repository, certainly was big enough for all of that. Can you imagine what we could learn if we got into it? Unfortunately, if there was a library, or you're talking about scrolls or anything that isn't stone, there's probably not going to be much down there, certainly not in the water-inundated areas. But it seems likely or even possible that there are deeper chambers here that are free of the groundwater, which is super intriguing. So, labyrinth exists, right? There's no doubt. I think the modern technology that's been used for it is revealing that it's probably even more incredible than the descriptions that have been given by the classical authors who actually visited the site. I mean, a 40-meter long freestanding metal object, that's very intriguing for a guy like Tim Akers to say that. Like, I think that's like, wow. I've not heard anything like that being described, like it's there and he's found it. Like everything else they've done, the Atlantica stuff, like where they point their things and they say there's something there, it seems to be, proven that there's something there. Unfortunately, the on-the-ground research has been suppressed. However, this new space-based technology, there aren't any borders and there's no permissions required to look at stuff from space, thankfully. As much as they're very interesting, they are being essentially dismissed with the old snorts of derision by Egyptologists. If you've heard what guys like Zahi and other people have to say about the Khafre scans or about any of these things, they just dismiss it and try to suppress it. It's not their discovery. The site is suffering neglect, like it is likely being damaged due to this, the rising water table, the salty groundwater that's in there at the Hawara site. However, I think we can remediate this. I think we could actually begin true exploration of the site with more awareness of the labyrinth. I think, yes, it might be expensive, but do you think it's worth it for what could be, I think, the discovery of the millennium? What might we find if we actually engaged and used our technology and our ability to do this. I think what it's going to take is more awareness, more people asking about it, and I genuinely think that if you've got enough like universities and archaeology departments interested in it, you could probably raise the funds and make this thing happen. I think it could actually be there. I genuinely still think that the discovery of the millennium is right there, just under the sand in Hawara, and we should be exploring it. To me, this is the number one opportunity to learn more about our history going forward. And doesn't it seem like an excellent target for the new scanning technology that's been discussed by Beyond Ian May? And according to Louis de Cordier, I don't want to let the cat out of the, I am, but he said they've actually agreed to scan at Hawara. So we might be getting another scan result at Hawara. Thank you guys very much. Cheers. So I've finished with a couple things. I think maybe got a little bit of time for some questions, maybe 10 minutes for questions, George. Yeah, it looks like it. But just before we do that, a couple other things I just wanted to briefly say. One is that I do want to pass on both respects and apologies from my very good friend Yusuf Ayawan for not being able to be here. We tried. The visa problem, he just couldn't get his visa done. They wouldn't respond. There was a whole back and forth. It didn't happen, unfortunately, for his visa. It's a little hard for him to travel as an Egyptian. We actually had a similar problem trying to get him to the UK in the past. It's not like he wants to live anywhere but Egypt, but it's tough being an Egyptian, apparently at times. And yes, of course, and if you want to come and see some of these sites with us, I do run, you can see some of the details here. My website, unchartedx.com, or my YouTube channel. I get into a lot of these different topics. Check out the videos. And I'm going to Peru in October, November this year, Egypt in December, and then again in March. So if you're interested in coming with us, check out the details on the website. And are there any questions? Or we give it up? Here first, I guess. Right. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, how old are the GPR surveys, and have I talked about this before? So the GPR surveys, the Mataha expedition was 2008. It wasn't released until around 2010 for a couple years, and then it disappeared. If you search high and low, you'll probably, in archive.org, you can probably find the PDF of the Mataha expedition. I can give it to you as well. I have it on my website, I think. And I did do a video on the Labyrinth, one of my earlier videos years ago, but there's a lot that's happened. I didn't know anything about the Merlin Burrows scans. I didn't know the details of the geoscan techniques. In fact, I was asking people for help to try and figure out what this was. I didn't know about the unit, like the Roclaw and the Cairo University groundwater expedition. And it's just always bothered me that the Labyrinth doesn't get the attention. I always want to talk about it, but to be honest, in the last couple of years, like the vase stuff has really that's been huge for me, like groundbreaking research. I think that's moving things forward. So I've always wanted to talk more about the Labyrinth, but a lot of the vase, I've got a bunch of different interest. And just on that topic with the vase, if you want to hear more about the vase, I am going to run through that stuff in detail tomorrow in my classroom session. We'll get into that and a bunch of other things. Yeah. The Barwabi Canal, yeah, it's 1830. So it was built in 1830. It's been there a long time. It's an established irrigation canal. Yeah, question is, does it intersect with what the canal, does it intersect with the Labyrinth? Yes. So they found, the Mataha expedition has found evidence for the Labyrinth on both sides. It's massive. So it's on both, so it's pretty much run right over the top of the Labyrinth. Most of the Labyrinth is to the south of the pyramid, but also on the other side of the canal. And this is also backed up by the scan results that you see from both GeoScan and the Merlin Burrows scan. So yes, it's on both. And this is one of the problems, right, with the site, is that this is why I suspect it was a political decision more than anything to cover up the fact that they'd found the Labyrinth. It's because you have to mess with that. And that thing connects to all the agriculture of the Fayum, and you're messing with farmers' waters, and oh my God, this is not a decision to be taken lightly in their defense. But still, I mean, it's it's the Labyrinth, greater than the pyramids. Right in the back. Has there been, and so the question is, has any of this technology been used to look into the Hall of Records? Is that the question? Yeah? Or the legends of the Hall of Records, I mean, as far as I know, it comes from Edgar Cayce, and he talks about, I think, one being at the Sphinx, one being, I forget now. It's not at Mount Nemrut, although that would be, Mount Nemrut to me would be another really interesting place to go and explore with some of this technology. Something being in the Atlantic Ocean. I don't know, to be honest, if any of this scanning technology has been used to explore kind of the locations. I hope that they do scan. I mean, lately he's been talking about like the Giza Plateau, and they scanned it. I mean, that's definitely one of the spots for the Hall of Records. Yeah. Yeah, good question. So the question was, with the water table being that high, have we thought about using aquatic drones or anything like that? The problem is it's sediment. Like if there's some water, but it's mostly mud. You hear Petrie's description, right? He said it's like filled to the roof with mud. We had to scrape some out so we can kind of push through. There might be some chambers that do have just water in them, but most of it is going to be like really wet dirt, like just saturated with dirt and sediment and mud. You can't get aquatic drones in there. It'd be great if there was, you could identify chambers where you could go in and explore that way. But I don't think so. I think mostly when you talk about groundwater, I mean, it's just bringing mud in and it's full of dirt and pebbles and whatever else. Yeah, so you're asking about the Minotaur and the Cretan labyrinth and any reason why the Egyptians had the labyrinth? Not that I've seen the reason why they built it. Some of the classical authors do attribute the labyrinth to different kings. They all have different accounts of which king were, and I'm sure what happened is that the Egyptians, when they get in there, as they were known to do in many other places, is that they would reuse these sites and bury their kings in them. Or like Ramses gets the statues and he hammers his name into them, right? These inherited artifacts and architecture become the property and eventually are attributed to different kings throughout time. I've not heard of any reason why they built it in the first place. It's just sort of there. It certainly seems to be the inspiration for the Cretan labyrinth. Like it seems everybody talks about Daedalus visiting, the labyrinth in Egypt and then going back and replicating a small part of it for King Minos. I mean, I don't know where the Minotaur comes from. That's a whole other thing. But I don't know why. If you look at Egypt, not only Egypt, but all around the world, the Chincanas in Cusco and the Coricancha. I mean, there's a lot of records and stories about these big underground chambers and halls, and it certainly seems to be a theme that's emerging with some of this new scanning technology, right? It looks like there is a lot more, and there's long been rumors, always, of subterranean infrastructure at all these places. You go down into I'd love to see scans done at Saqqara. I mean, we know there's miles and miles of tunnels and chambers, and I can tell you from personal experience, going down to the very bottom levels at Saqqara, beneath the step pyramid, or even on a special permission, they don't let you down to the very bottom level, but I've been down there, down another 30-foot ladder, and there's actually big, not massive, but big open, it's not just tunnels, there's big high-ceiling chambers, and then at one point there's a shaft that keeps going down further, and down at the bottom is groundwater. They can't keep exploring. They know there's probably many more deeper layers there, and there's certainly historical accounts of it there, but the groundwater's risen, so they stop digging. They're like, oh, well, the water's down there, we've got to stop here. So, yeah, for whatever reason, they were building stuff underground. All right, one more, real quick. Yep. Yeah, I got you quick. So yeah, the question is the groundwater's rising in Egypt, but the Assyrian level doesn't seem to be changing. I showed you pictures of the Assyrian. The Assyrian's a special case for a number of reasons. One is that the Assyrian is, first of all, the water is coming from a specific aquifer. It's not really coming from the groundwater at the Assyrian. It's actually, I don't know what the groundwater has to do with the Assyrian, to be honest, but most of that water, it's one of the problems with them trying to figure out how deep it is. There's actually water pressure being pushed up from an aquifer that's built on top of a very small, very specific aquifer. They built that thing on top of something. Kind of crazy when you think about it. And yes, the other reason is they are actively remediating the level of water. In fact, if they turn those pumps off that are running in there, they have remediation wells, like they pump it out and they dump it sort of onto the water table in another, just not that far away. The water would be above the ground level in the Assyrian today. So they have to keep running it. I mean, I talked to the guy. Their problem is funding. They don't have any money. He got mad one trip when we didn't do a special permission to go down in there, because it's like thousands of dollars and some of that goes to them. He's like, why aren't you coming down in? I'm like, well, not on this trip, bro, but the next one for sure. But he says they're going to be using muck pumps, because again, same problem, right? The water level, we know it's deep, but it's muck, it's mud. So they need a proper muck pump to pump that stuff out and then start to plumb those depths. You can find old photographs from when they did drop that water level, and you can see the multiple levels. And then it was also just full of debris. Like when they'd been quarrying that, all the granite pieces had fallen in the canal, in like the canals around this central island. So they've been slowly pulling that out. They have been cleaning that side up. They've pulled a lot of the debris out of there that has been there the last few years, and it's not there anymore. They're piling it up in another room. But yeah, Assyrian's a special case. All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.